Welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit about Chapter 16, the senses and special senses. But before we get there, we need to talk about a few other things. Now, one of the themes that we've talked about in anatomy and physiology so far is this idea of stimulus and receptors, right? So we know that in order for our body to receive a sense or some sort of stimulus, we have to have a receptor for it. And that receptor has to be very specific for that stimulus. Now, we've talked about this with neurotransmitters, is that the receptor for a neurotransmitter has to be specific for that neurotransmitter, right? Acetylcholine receptors respond to acetylcholine. Norepinephrine receptors respond to norepinephrine. We've talked about those. That concept continues as we talk about receptors for other stimuli, such as touch or pain or light for vision or hearing. We have to have a receptor that's specific for it. So for example, there's light touching my hand, but I can't see that light by using the receptors in my hand. I don't have light receptors there. I only have light receptors in my eye. So they have to be very specific for each other. If you want to receive a stimulus, you have to have a receptor for it, right? So that stimulus is going to be some sort of change in sensory information. It could be light, it could be temperature, it could be pain, it could be a variety of things. We could even talk about this, and we will talk about this more in the next chapter when we're talking about endocrine, that you have to have a receptor that's specific for that hormone. This is a big theme that is consistent throughout the anatomy and physiology. We'll talk about it more throughout this semester. Now, one other thing that we have, because we're talking about senses, is this idea of sensation. In sensation, when we use this term, we're talking about the conscious awareness of a sensory information, right? Conscious awareness. So where in your brain do you think you'd have to have this projected to in order for you to be aware of sensory information? Hopefully you said the cerebral cortex, right? That's where we have that sensory awareness. That's our consciousness, our perception. All takes place in that cerebral cortex. So hopefully you said cerebral cortex. So whether you're smelling or you're tasting, all this information, if you want to know what it is, it has to make it to the cerebral cortex. If you want to be aware of it, it has to make it to the cerebral cortex. All right. So let's talk about receptors a little bit more. What is a receptor? It's a transducer. Okay, I don't know what that means. All right, let me explain. So when we have information, let's draw a neuron here. And yes, my amazing art skills are back. Right, here's our dendrites and cell body. And I'll draw a nice long axon here. And put some axons and rows. Right, okay? And so what a receptor is, a transducer. So we can have receptors over here on the dendrites, right? Draw some receptors here. And what they're going to do is they're going to take that information, whatever that sensory information is, and they're going to change it into another form. So we know that the only way that information travels along this neuron here is in what form? Like, how do we have information travel along the length of this neuron, this axon? I'll give you a hint. Is it a graded potential or an action potential? Hopefully you said an action potential, right? This is an action potential. And action potentials, remember, are electrical. They're electrical, right? That's electrical energy. Remember, we saw the voltage go from about minus 70 up to positive 20, positive 30, and then back down, right? We have depolarization and repolarization. That was all electrical energy. And so what receptors do is they take that stimulus and they convert it from whatever form it is into electrical activity, right? So always converting it to electrical activity. So meaning an action potential. So if it's a touch receptor, I'm going to take in physical, mechanical touch of my finger, I'm going to turn it into electrical information. The electrical information is going to be action potential, bringing that information up into my dorsal ganglion, into the spinal cord, and then it's going to synapse and carry that electrical information up to my brain, to the thalamus, and then it's going to carry that electrical information to the primary somatosensory cortex. All that's electrical, right? All those are action potentials. And so we're going to turn it from one form, like a mechanical pressing on my finger, into electrical information. As far as vision goes, it takes light and turns it into electrical information. Hearing takes sound waves, turns it into electrical information. So all of our receptors are transducers, and what they're doing is converting it into electrical information, action potentials. So what's a receptive field? We've touched on this before when we were in last semester, and we talked a little bit about the homunculus and that type of thing. But here's what it is. This is our ability to discriminate touch. And as you can see here, we are looking at the skin, right? Our ability to discriminate touch. And so if you have a small receptive field, right? A small receptive field, you're going to have information come from that little receptive field. So just a little small area on the tip of your finger, you're going to have sensory information coming from. And there'll be a bunch of other small receptive fields, right? So if I took and decided to poke you, I'm going to poke you with a needle that has two prongs to it. Alright, that's a terrible needle. It has two prongs to it. It's likely that you're going to feel two different points, right? Because those receptive fields are small. When we think about our fingers, we think about really discriminative touch, right? And the only way we can carry that information back is if we have very small receptive fields. That also means there's lots of neurons coming from these receptive fields, right? There's lots of them because each receptive field would have a neuron association with it. If you have a large receptive field, like you see over here on this side, it's hard to discriminate where that point is. But notice where the example is. This is on our back. We don't need to have a small receptive field on our back. We don't have like discriminatory touch with our back. I'll give you a little analogy here. Like you think about somebody scratching your back. Oh, I got an itch. It's like, oh yeah, go ahead and scratch here. Oh no, up here. No, to the right. No, down to the left. No, back to the left. All right, now up a little. No, back to the left. Down. Oh yeah, that's the spot, right? We kind of have this itching. And so it's really hard to discriminate where in this receptive field that itch may be. So that's an analogy just to explain an idea of how that might work that you've had experience with. So small receptive fields, lots of discriminative touch, lots of neurons coming from it. Large receptive field, not very discriminative, right? And only one neuron coming from it, right? Now, if I take and I go back and I take my little needle thing, a little bit better drawing, and I put that down here, if both of these points go into that one receptive field, I'm only going to feel 1 point. I'm only going to feel 1 point because they both go into that same receptive field. Alright, hope that makes sense. Alright, let's talk a little bit more about tonic receptors versus phasic receptors. This is a really cool concept. Tonic receptors are always going to respond to a stimulus. They're tonic, they're constant, they're going to respond to a stimulus. Especially things like pain, right? Always going to respond to pain. We want to be aware of pain. It lets us know that something's wrong. Balance receptors in the ear. We always know where our body is and we're always in balance. Those are going to be tonic receptors. So we're constantly going to have those. Now, phasic receptors, if you think about phasic receptors, you kind of even hear the word phase in there, right? That there's a phase with these receptors. And so think about if this morning maybe you put on a ring or a watch or glasses or something that you put on this morning. You probably aren't really aware of that anymore, right? Now you can jiggle your watch or your ring and be aware of it again, but you aren't really aware of those things because your receptors have gone out of phase, right? They have adapted to that sensory information. You may have walked into somebody's house and said, oh man, these are some good smelling cookies. And then a couple minutes later, you can't even smell the cookies anymore. Or maybe the house smells terrible. After a couple of minutes, you don't smell it. Because those receptors adapted to that stimulus. Another example, maybe you've been in the grocery store and all of a sudden you're like, I've really got to urinate. And you hold it. And hold it. And eventually that sensation goes away and you have to urinate because those receptors have adapted to the fullness of your bladder. Okay? So that's kind of how phasic receptors work. Now your bladder gets a little bit fuller and you have to urinate again, right? So that's how that would work. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about receptors. We can classify receptors based upon 3 different criteria: their distribution, the stimulus of the origin, and their modality. Right? So what does this mean? Let's go through each one. So the first category we have is receptor distribution. Receptor distribution is pretty simple. It is, I'm going to go special sense first, right? Special sense are for those special senses we have. Vision, right? Hearing and balance, smell, taste. Notice those are only associated with special organs like your tongue, your nose, ears, your eyes, right? Special organs, they're in the face, they're going to be responsible for only one type of information, right? So that's special sense. Those are located within the face, within specialized organs like your eyes and ears, okay? General senses are from other parts of the body, distributed widely, right? So you think about temperature. Can you feel temperature in your face? Sure. Can you feel it in your fingers? Yep. Big toe? Absolutely, right? General sensory information. And so somatic sensory receptors come from things like your skin, right? You have temperature and pain and touch, and you feel those in different places of your body. Visceral sensory, on the other hand, comes from your internal organs, right? So, for example, like your heart. Right? Again, this isn't part of the face, but it is a sensory receptor. It's visceral. We know the word visceral is referring to our internal organs, and so there's your receptor distribution. So it can be general sense, or it can be special sense. It could also be the stimulus of origin, right? So basically, stimulus of origin means that we have the sensory information is either going to come from inside our body or outside of our body. Okay, so there's our guy. Oh, yeah. Some hair. All right, so exteroreceptors means that the external environment is where the stimulus is coming from. So we can easily say, okay, touch, yep, that's coming from outside the environment, not coming from inside my body. Touch, temperature, a lot of that information comes from outside the body. What about vision? Yeah, the light's coming from outside of our body, right? The light is coming from outside of our body. It's not coming from inside our body. Taste, yep, food's coming from outside of our body. Smell, yep, those are coming from outside of our body. Hearing, yep, sound waves are coming from outside of our body. Those are all exteroreceptors, right? They respond to external stimuli. Interoreceptors, information coming from inside the body. Things like a lot of the stuff we're not conscious of, like heart rate, blood pressure, carbon dioxide levels, those types of things. Interoreceptors inside the body. A kind of weirdo one is proprioceptors. Proprioceptors, they come from like our joints and our skin, telling us where our body is located in space, from our muscles and tendons. If you remember that from last semester. So proprioceptors, the information comes from inside the body, but we're consciously aware of it, helping us understand where our body is in the environment. And finally is modality of stimulus. So modality of stimulus means like, what is it going to respond to? What is that stimulus that it's actually going to respond to? And so we look at this and we say, okay, chemoreceptors, they're going to respond to a chemical. And that chemical has to be dissolved in fluid. So, for example, your taste buds, they'll respond to chemicals. The food that you put in your mouth are chemicals. And if you took your tongue and you dry it off, right? You dry it off, use a towel, dry it off, and then maybe a hairdryer on a cold setting, don't burn your tongue, dry off your tongue, and then throw some salt on it. If your tongue is dry, you will not be able to taste it. If you put just a little bit of fluid so that it can be dissolved, you'll taste it. It has to be dissolved in fluid. So chemoreceptors respond to chemicals. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Salt, sweet, bitter. Okay? Thermoreceptors respond to temperature. Photoreceptors, I'm sure you can guess, respond to light. Mechanoreceptors is any sort of mechanical distortion. It could be touch, it could be vibration of sound waves. We'll talk about those more in detail as well. Baroreceptors, they respond to pressure. Really, this is going to be stretch of a blood vessel a lot of times, or a tube a lot of times, that we'll be aware of that as a baroreceptor. And finally, nociceptors are pain. Right? Pressure. All right. Hope this helps. Understand this. So when we take these three concepts and we put them together, we can have three different classifications for a single receptor type. So if you think about it for the eye, right, for the vision receptors, first of all, what is its receptor distribution? Is it a special sense or a general sense? Eye. Special sense, right? It's going to be for vision. Is the stimulus coming from inside the body or outside the body? The light is coming from outside the body, so it's an exteroreceptor. And finally, the specific modality of stimulus, and that's going to be a photoreceptor responding to light. So you have all those different options right there. All right, hope this helps, this concept. See you soon.